I have also ideas about urbanism. I think in terms of the urban aggregation of what individual architects put up, there's a huge lack. It is a very chaotic process. Actually, the chaos comes from the planners who have arbitrary decisions of what to put where, some kind of preconceived schemas which are never matching the actual co-location synergies, which can only be discovered in a free process. But the visual expression of this is a discipline's task, and that implies that all the elements which are placed and agglomerated in the city, let's assume under free market conditions of free choices being made, and the most potent and best funded choices, most probably also the most valuable choice, come through. The architect then has to have the task of making that legible, making these connections and synergy aspects visible, those aspects which motivated the location of this building should become then transparent and visible so that they could be most utilized. So that's my theory of urbanism, and that is something which cannot be single-handedly delivered. That can only be delivered by the discipline as a whole, because the city has hundreds and thousands of architects working, and they need to understand their task and be updated to the contemporary principles of how one can generate that urban fabric. And if they're all working on different paradigms, if they're all self-indulgent, working on some retro style, or singing their own tune, and then when they come together, they generate visual chaos. That's what we have now, and nobody likes that. Totally global. I think China is, for us, one of the most important arenas to explore contemporary architecture, and that has been so for the last 15 years, actually. And I think China is now going through a major transformation from manufacturing into the knowledge economy, and that makes it even more relevant for us, because there's new challenges for urbanism and architecture, new type of architecture, and I think there's just a lot of work, which is great. The discipline of architecture in China has also matured a lot, has evolved, and there's a lot of smart architects and thinkers and a lot of talent, but the new talent, the emerging architects, have not yet risen to the scale of their task. So I think they're small studios at the moment. They're interested in developing an artistry, an architectural sensibility, and they're having very small projects, most of them at the moment. And sometimes I feel they're too happy in doing these small projects and should scale up and participate in the urbanization process of China more actively and on the larger scale. So that would be my assessment. But I think this will happen. Maybe it needs a bit of prompting that the talented and architects with ambitions and artistic ambitions should not be shying away from large commercial projects, mixed-use projects, larger citywide master plans and so on. And this idea of doing small things in the villages is not the answer. Okay, yes, so in my book I described the theory of society of Niklas Luhmann. He's talking about functional differentiation of the functional subsystems or discourses, disciplines, and I think it's very perceptive and important insight. So we have the different expertises and different specialisms, obviously, and they are science-led, theory-led, and with professional practices, and they need to fit to each other. Each have their own responsibility, But on the avant-garde and leadership side of each disciplines, they have to that's where the responsibility is to update the discipline. So with an architecture, it means that the leaders of the field need to be aware of the overall societal trends, of the other aspects. Where's the economy evolving? Where are the political systems evolving? It's because the built environment has to fit into an overall societal process. We are in charge of some aspects of the development of the built environment as architects and urbanists. We are not in charge of the political innovations, but we need to understand where they are and would be going, so we need to be familiar with overall theory of society. That's what I've tried to develop, that understanding, and now try to guide my disciplines to fit into an overall process of innovation, which in the end, the big category we need to watch out for is what I call, prosperity, which is a catch-all for having more degrees of material and social freedom and having a better life. That prosperity it depends a lot on the productivity of our labors, so that we have less and less necessary labor and more free exploratory life energy. And yet at the time we are kind of empowered on that planet, and we can feel very much empowered that we can be cosmopolitan, we can fly around the world, being comfortable wherever we are. We don't feel the material, physical hardships of our elder or grandparents' generation. That's progress, and the built environment has a very important role to play. And that's our task. And that's in very, very general terms, because I want to fit the architectural project to the societal project. Yes, of course. The whole point is this. ZAR Architects under my leadership, and also prior to that, I mean, I have been leading at the ZAR for many years, is of course a highly directed project, a theory-led practice, which also uses research to guide the solutions. The solution space is universal, so we're claiming universal competency with respect to all aspects of the built environment, urban, architectural, interior, product, all of that understood though with that challenge, how do we generate the next stage of the civilization, that urban civilization, which I believe is based on a much more urban concentration for the so-called network society, where all we do all day is generate interactions and cooperations and updating of information, and we are information workers, and we are all creative workers. So I think the cities are creative industry hubs, because the physical execution of these ideas will be outsourced to robotic factories, which could be on the outskirts. So that's the world we're living in, and we need to design for these knowledge hubs, this creative industry and creative interaction spaces, very open, very porous. And we need to particularly look at the tech industry. There are some leaders like Google or Tencent. We should look how they actually construct their spaces, where they choose their location, like in the center, for instance, in downtown Manhattan, and what kind of spaces they're wanting to create, and we want to help them. Our task is, that's what I'm working on research on with students at the AA or at the GSD, to try to understand what the city should be like, to make that most elegant, pleasurable, stimulating, but particularly most productive. So we all have a much better life, so the civilization evolves. That's the task, and as I said earlier, it is all about complexity, dynamism, and keep making that not menacing, but navigable. So the whole discipline of architecture needs to invest in digital technology and digital intelligence, working with algorithms to meet the challenge of the new level of complexity and dynamism in the built environment. And downstream, the construction industry has to invest in digital fabrication. Now, we are interested in it, and we're trying to push that forward, also various schools of architecture, because it's important to have an understanding of the possibilities downstream to inform the design repertoire upstream, even ahead of the time, even before the downstream possibilities are fully ready everywhere. So that's the role of the avant-garde, to be prepared to innovate. But I think in a few years, this will be universal, and you would not have to talk about this anymore. This is a new condition of life, that you communicate, for instance, telecommunicate via mobiles, etc. It's not something you have to think about. You think about the content of the work, and you take for granted that it is developed through digital means. Well, as I said, the essential part here is that all the elements of architecture become variable and malleable, adaptive, adapt to each other, and adapt to environmental conditions at the same time, and to internal use conditions. So that's the essence, whereas all prior architecture had ideal types, prototypical elements and typologies, which had very little adaptive capacity. So that's the key. There's a new subsidiary style within the epoch and paradigm of parametrism, which I call tectonism, which is the way the avant-garde movement of parametrism has matured and evolved, precisely what we talked earlier, incorporating fabrication potentials early on into the morphologies, but also other engineering intelligences like contemporary structural engineering, environmental engineering. They're all parametric, they're all computationally based, and they allow for much more optimized solutions. So that's tectonism. The other element I'm working on is that we as architects need to think about organizing and ordering social processes on a new level of complexity and dynamism, so we have much more open, porous, and complex spaces. But at that point of complexity, it becomes important to pay attention to the legibility of these spaces, because we can no longer take for granted that users can orient easily in these very complex environments. So we make that an explicit problem for creating a visually tractable, perceptually tractable design. That's one project I call phenomenology. And the next one is we have that kind of proliferation of offerings in the built environment with many different kinds of public spaces, actors in the urban domain, private or public, who offer spaces, and to make informed choices and navigate this offering is also important that we develop something which I call the semiology of space. And for that we also need a rich repertoire of design. So we need the repertoire of design, which is parametric and tectonic, becomes also expressive. And that's the core competency of architecture, in my view, is the communication capacity and what I call information-rich environments. So it makes it easy to understand and navigate and really utilize that proliferation of dense urban offerings in ways which don't rely on that you know already where to go. The whole point is that we are now moving into urban spaces where we want to browse an offering and discover things and make choices, ad hoc choices, rather than navigating the offering through lists or on your mobile, which you do it directly in the three-dimensional space. And I think that interface of communication, which is the full three-dimensionality of the built environment, is a much more higher bandwidth, which also uses much more of our senses of understanding the environment than looking at your mobile phone. There's only one message at a time which you can absorb. That's an important task for architects, to look at the built environment as a medium of communication and navigation. Well, I mean, one of the challenge is always to make sure that the firm is growing and that we give opportunity to our key staff and opportunity to new staff. For that we need to watch out. So some of the challenges is the political instability and economic instability of the world. We need to be a global company because we cannot be exposed too much. We have to diversify around the globe. So that's a challenge, to always find those markets, those new projects, because very often times there's kind of business cycles where a market is opening up and then closes down before the projects get realized. That's very frustrating. So that's one challenge. The other challenge is to keep a consistent, as we grow, to keep a consistent quality, but also innovative thrust, that we make sure that each project has some degree of innovation, and also that we're building reputation rather than consuming reputation with each project. That's a big challenge. So to keep everybody within the firm updated, energized, and you have to find mechanism of letting hundreds of people participate in that project which we have. So, well, the biggest change was for me the personal loss and the presence of Zaha. We've been communicating so closely for 30 years, every day nearly, and to have that energy and challenge and dialogue. In terms of the corporate processes, they had actually been well established and well organized, and we didn't make any changes. So I kept the same way of working going. Before we did everything together, the two of us. Now I'm doing it by myself. In terms of what I am contributing, which is mostly design leadership, intellectual leadership, some presentation and client relations, but not all of them for sure. So these aspects, I keep them going. Didn't have to change. It was on the side of work. We keep the same spirit and the same energy, and the people are also very committed and remain committed to the firm. So we didn't lose anybody.